Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's fabulous to see many familiar faces. I've met many already. I hope to see many more in the days to come. And it's a real honor to be asked to share a few words to open the scholarly part of this event. We are so proud, we, the Standing Committee for International Conferences on Thinking, so proud to be able to work these couple of years with Ana and Javier, to hear their thoughts, to make any suggestions we can, and to help in modest ways to prepare this marvelous event. I want to emphasize that the role of the Standing Committee is by and large to stand out of the way. We try to make original arrangements, try to choose a good setting, try to offer some recommendations, and then by and large get out of the way. So almost everything you see happening over these days will be the product of the hard thinking and the good planning that Ana and Javier and their many colleagues have done in working toward these days. So we should all thank them very much. So here we are, and I want to share a few thoughts about this theme, which is very much the theme of the entire series of international conferences on thinking, making the most of the mind. You may have read in the program about where all this began, and I will put it back on your mind here. Conference number 1 in this series was in 1982 on the islands of Fiji. How about that? And here we are today, number 17, 2015. I can't believe it's still going. Unbelievable. Certainly, none of us involved in the early days would have imagined that our exploration of these ideas would still have momentum. And yet, every couple of years, there's been another such event. Out of curiosity, let me just ask, the previous International Conference on Thinking was in Wellington, New Zealand. Is anybody here who was at that conference? Wellington, quite a few people. Quite a few people. The one before that was in Northern Ireland. Anybody at that conference? Yes, quite a few in Belfast. How many people in this room have been at any of the previous international conferences on thinking? Let's see all the hands. Quite a few. Okay, if you see somebody near you with a hand raised later on, you might want to talk with them and say, what was it like then? What is it like now? Because believe me, one thing we've learned, they're all different. And that's part of the point. This is not a cookie cutter event with a constant plan each time. Each International Conference on Thinking is very much the vision of the particular organizers and their colleagues. And we think that's a tremendously important part of this. Well, number 1, number 17, 1982, 2015, what is this all about? Over the next few minutes, I'll share a perspective on what it's all about, certainly not the only perspective. And the perspective I want to share concerns making the most of the mind. After all, if anything, the International Conference on Thinking is about making the most of the minds of our children, the minds of politicians, the minds of business people, the minds of medical personnel. We would like a smarter world. So what does it look like to cultivate a smarter world? Now, today I'm going to offer a very particular perspective on that you might find a little strange. However, I will try to make something of a case for this particular perspective. I'd like to talk about these themes. First, 3 key qualities of the human mind. Next, how thinking skills hack the mind. Yes, I'm talking about things like computer hackers. I'm making a kind of an analogy here. However, one thing you may not be aware of is this. When we talk about hacking, we usually think of evil hackers who try to get your bank accounts. But there is actually, in the computer world, a very different tradition of hacking, good hacking. And I want to make an analogy with good hacking. I'll get to that in a minute. So how thinking skills hack the mind. Third, hacking to look at the other side. This is a particular area where there's a lot of research, and I'm going to share just a tiny bit of that research as an example, looking at the other side of the case. Fourth, why the mind needs hacking. Why should we be thinking in those terms? Why might this be a good thing to do? 10 ways of hacking the mind, just quick examples, many of which are familiar, but I want to develop the analogy. Hacking as empowerment versus entrapment, because those evil hackers are out there, and I'll say a word about them. And how to make hacking the mind last, how to make it stick, how to do today what will still be there tomorrow or next year. And finally, a few words of summary, and that will be it. So let me try to get started on this exploration of what it is to make the most of the mind. Theme number 1, 3 key qualities of the human mind. Now, to start to talk about this, we need a thinker. We need a being that acts in the world. So let's see if we can bring on stage a thinking being. There's my little thinking being. Of course, this is really a hand puppet. You can buy these things with the eyes and use them on your hand. But I have a reason for choosing something like this, because where life starts and where thought starts is with perception and action. And this little creature is set up for that. It has eyes and it has a hand. It can look at the world and it can act in the world. And when, over evolutionary time, you have creatures that can look at the world, perceive it, and act, what starts to develop between perception and action is intelligence, slowly, gradually, and in many ways. So we could imagine this very basic vision here of a creature that perceives and acts, and ask what it takes to make this creature really sophisticated. Well, right now, this creature does not have any world in which to participate. So let's give our little person here a frog to look at. Now, our little person is engaged with the world. And in what way? Well, I'm going to use the word intuition. A fundamental fact of the way we all behave in the world is our initial engagement is basically intuitive. If I'm walking across the room, I don't think about what I'm doing, I just do it. But it's very important to recognize that when we speak of intuition, just everyday, ordinary intuition, our immediate reactions to situations are very often very smart. We read other people's intentions. We understand situations. We navigate through life's complexities, moment to moment, engaging the world right there in front of us, right there with us, in very smart moment-to-moment ways. So this is the first quality of mind that I want to emphasize: immediate, engaged intuition, very intelligent, very smart. Authors like Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink, for instance, emphasize how very smart our immediate responses can be. But suppose we want to get a little fancier than that, a little more sophisticated than that. What would that look like? Well, let's take away the frog, and let's give our little person here something else to look at. Let's give him a representation to look at. What you have here is not the frog, but a picture of a frog. In fact, it's a diagram of the frog, like from a biology textbook, with the various parts of the frog labeled. This is one of the most fundamental shifts we find in human development, because if there is one thing that characterizes our species, it's the intensive use of representations. In our everyday lives, much of the time we find ourselves facing not the immediate world, the frog, but books, music, equations, images, and so on. Here are some of them: cave drawings, stories like Don Quixote, paintings like the famous painting of Don Quixote by Picasso, maps, and of course, complicated equations. Now consider what this adds. It's one thing if I can just engage the world in front of me, the frog. But if I, as a thinking being, can operate through representations, through language, through images, through equations, and so forth, there's a huge expansion in what I can think about. I can think about something on the other side of the world. I can think about a fantasy world that doesn't really exist. I can do so much. There's an interesting author and historian by the name of David Christian who has developed the notion of big history. One of the things David Christian discusses is, what is it that makes humans human? And he suggests that key to the way we operate is collective learning. We don't just live and die, we live and pass on our knowledge to later generations. And to do that, we need representations. We need language. We need books. We need diagrams. These days we even need equations. It's all a matter of what we do with representations. So that's the second quality of mind I want to add to that immediate powerful intuition, is the use of representations. Now, all of these so far are external representations, what I might say, what I might write, what I might draw. But there's another representational system tremendously important to our mental lives, and that's our internal imaginations. We don't just write, we don't just talk, we don't just draw, we imagine. Cognitive scientists, psychologists, and so forth often talk about working memory. So for instance, if you're planning a little trip in your head, or planning how to handle a job interview, you kind of use your working memory to sketch out what might happen. But the point has been made by psychologists that working memory isn't just a memory. It's more like a simulation space. It's a space in our minds where we can sketch all sorts of scenarios. If he does this, I might do that. On the other hand, I could do that. We can make mental movies. We can do simple calculations in our head. We can anticipate possibilities. So it's not just the external representations that empower us as human beings. It's this very powerful simulation space that we have that is immensely flexible, that allows us to think what happened 20 years ago, and even allows us to imagine what might happen 20 years from now. There's a little bit of research on non-human animals. Some non-human animals seem to have a little bit of this, but the reach of our internal mental representations appears to be far, far beyond any non-human animal. So that's my second theme, my second key quality. Representations, the incredibly powerful use of representations, external and internal. And let's take one more step. What else could this little person be looking at? It could be looking at a picture of itself. After all, it has the capacity to deal with representations. Why not represent itself to itself? This has a funny name. I'm going to call it recursion. Recursion is a technical term from mathematics and computer science, and it means systems that operate on themselves. Systems that act upon themselves are recursive. If you like, you could say metacognition. But recursion is more specific than metacognition. It has directly to do with acting on oneself. And when we have this representational capacity I've emphasized, with it, we get a recursive capacity to act upon ourselves as thinkers, to edit our own patterns of thought. And that is a tremendous leap. And when we explore improving people's thinking, improving our own thinking, that is what empowers us to do so. It empowers us to think about our thinking and make up strategies, like make a pro-con list, use a Venn diagram, brainstorm, the image on the far right, or ask ourselves powerful questions like, what's the real problem? I'm assuming the problem is this, but what's the real problem? The problem behind the problem? And many, many other things. Any of these kinds of moves, and 100 more that are very common in the thinking skills movement, all of them are examples of the mind acting on the mind, the recursive power of the mind to represent itself, to read what it's doing, and to redirect it in new, more powerful directions. So, those three key qualities are what we build upon. The intuition to engage the immediate world, representations which vastly expand the world we can engage, and we can engage those representations intuitively also, not just the immediate world, and the recursive power to act on ourselves as thinkers. That's the foundation. Now let me go from there. How thinking skills hack the mind. Well, I'm going right back to this diagram, the same one we saw before. Here's our little person, and our person is thinking about these familiar thinking skills, like use a pro-con list, use a Venn diagram, do brainstorming, ask yourself powerful questions like, what's the real problem? What is the nature of these kinds of strategies? What are they really about? As we ask ourselves this question, let's ask ourselves, how hard is it really to do these things? How hard is it to learn and use a pro-con list? How many think it's pretty hard to do that? How many think it's pretty easy to do that? Pretty easy to learn to use a pro-con list? Yeah, it's pretty easy. Have you ever taught anybody to use a pro-con list? Who's taught somebody to use a pro-con list? Just in class or anyone? Yeah, a few people have. Did it take you 3 months? Did it take you a week? 10 minutes? Yeah, something like 10 minutes. These things are actually pretty easy to do. What about this? A Venn diagram. How many people have used a Venn diagram? Was it hard? Did it take you 3 months to learn how to do it? I don't think so. What about brainstorming? Brainstorming has 3 or 4 rules. If you follow them reliably, you get pretty good results. It's not very hard to learn brainstorming. You know, people forget it and they need to be reminded, but the basic moves are pretty easy. With that in mind, let me contrast two views of what's happening. We talk about thinking skills. And usually when we talk about a skill, we're talking about something that takes a long time to develop, requires a huge amount of practice, like skating or skateboarding, or like using complex mathematics, or even just everyday mathematics with all the practice it requires to learn the long division and the addition and so forth and so on. Usually when we talk about skills, that's what we have in mind, a long up-ramp of learning. But you know what? Most of the things that are called thinking skills aren't like that. They're actually rather easy to learn and rather easy to teach. Now, I don't mind if we call them skills. That's fine. We can call them whatever we want. But if we want to get careful about it, it's interesting to see that something kind of different is going on, and I'm going to call it hacking the mind. Let me motivate that a little bit. First of all, I'm talking about positive hacking, not the evil things that people trying to get at your bank account do. Here's a little definition. Hacking in the computer tradition involves leveraging what's there. You don't program something new and elaborate and fancy. You take advantage of what's already there. Here's a longer definition. Getting something to work outside its normal range in a relatively simple way, leveraging existing capacities rather than developing complex new capacities. Think about how well that fits, for instance, a pro-con list. It's not that hard to learn. But people tend not to think about the other side of the case. They tend not to think about the cons. But a little bit of prompting, a simple diagram and so forth, and people are much better at it. That's getting something to work outside its normal range, outside what people normally often do, in a relatively simple way, leveraging existing capacities. We already can think of cons. That's something within our reach, even if we tend not to do it, rather than developing complex new capacities, hacking the mind. And there's a spirit to it, too. In the positive, proactive spirit of hacking, these kinds of processes are proactive, they're parsimonious, they're not really very complex, they operate on a lean budget, and they're playful. Hacking the mind. So, let me suggest that it's worth exploring this notion of hacking the mind that reflects so much of what we do with so-called thinking skills, and draw out the implications of that for how to make the most of the mind. Let's talk about looking at the other side of an issue. We already started to talk about that. Why do I want to talk about this? Well, for one reason, there's a huge amount of research on it. A lot of psychologists have asked, what happens when people are asked their opinion about an issue and then asked to give reasons for their opinion? So, imagine we have an issue and it has two sides. It has the sort of yellow side and the blue side. Imagine I ask you, well, just informally, how do you see this? And you say, oh, I kind of see it as the yellow side. I lean toward the yellow side of the issue, okay? Then I ask you, give me some reasons on both sides. I don't just say the yellow side. I say, give me some reasons on both sides. This is my little experiment. So let me ask you to make predictions. This is a kind of an experiment that has been done 50 times, at least, by various researchers in various places. If I say, what's your leaning? And you say the yellow side, and I ask you to give me reasons on both sides, what do you think you get? Do you get pretty 50-50 reasons on both sides? How many think it's pretty even? How many think you get mostly reasons on the yellow side? People are cautious. You don't want to commit yourselves. But yes, that's what you get. You get mostly reasons on this side, the yellow side, and maybe you get one reason on the other side. Now, this does vary from person to person. It's not the same for everyone. Some people are more even, but the strong trend is to think about the issue in a one-sided way, even when directly asked up front, give me some reasons on both sides. Okay. Well, if that were all there was to it, it wouldn't be very interesting, but a number of psychologists, including our own group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, people like, for instance, John Barron, another psychologist, people like Keith Stanovich, yet another, have done a whole series of interesting experiments around this kind of situation. And I want to tell you just a little bit about what they found. So, here's a question. One question we might ask when we find that most people give reasons on the yellow side, one question we might ask is, are they able, if pushed, to give reasons on the blue side? Maybe their minds are all tangled up. Maybe they're so fixated on the yellow side, they just can't think of reasons on the blue side. It's a very good question, and researchers have tried this. After just asking for, in general, reasons on both sides, you ask something like, suppose you had to, could you list 5 reasons on the blue side? Or something like that. So, I'm going to ask you, what do you think happens if I ask you directly to list reasons on the blue side? Could you easily do that, even though you favor the yellow side? How many people think you could easily do that? Well, I see a lot of hands going up. And you're right, that's the universal finding. If simply asked directly, in general, people can easily mention significant reasons on the other side. So it's not that they're fixated blindly on the issue. They have the mental room to think more broadly. Well, here's another interesting question that researchers have asked. Do people think they should think of reasons on the other side? I mean, they're willing to if you ask them to, but do they think they should? Do they think it's a good thing to do, an appropriate thing to do? How many people out there think that if you press people, they say, well, now that you mention it, I really should think about the other side? How many people, do you think people say, yeah, I should think about the other side? Some people think so. How many people in this group think, well, maybe people often say, nah, I shouldn't think about the other side? Well, it's pretty mixed. Well, I tell you what's been found out. Often people say, no, I shouldn't think about the other side. That's not a good argument. That doesn't make the case. People are concerned with presenting a strong case, often more than getting at what's going on with a complex issue. So they often say, no, I shouldn't particularly. In our own research, we found that about 50% of some middle school children we've worked with say you should when directly asked, and about 50% say you shouldn't. John Barron, in some of his research on this, probed some of the reasons and found that people have a kind of a mental model of what's a good argument. And they think that a good argument makes a strong case. Not that a good argument is fair. That's not their mental model. Their mental model of a good argument is not a fair argument. Their mental model of a good argument is one that makes a strong case. It's a lawyer's mental model. Very interesting. Let's ask another question. What does this have to do with IQ or other measures of complex cognition? Are people who are a lot more able fairer in exploring an issue? Do they balance better between one side and the other? And again, I'm going to ask you for your guess. How many people think that those with high IQs are more balanced in looking at issues? Yeah, a couple do. How many people think that people with high IQs are not necessarily particularly more balanced in looking at issues? Yeah, well, it's sort of about 50-50 out there. All right. This has been researched multiple times, including in our own group, John Barron, Keith Sanovich, and others. No, people with high IQ are not statistically more balanced in looking at issues. Yeah, there's a difference. If you look at people with high IQs, they give more reasons. They have more to say. But it's like this. They have a lot more to say on their own side, and only a little more to say on the other side. They're just as biased as anybody else. This is very interesting because it says that there are important parts of good thinking that are not even about IQ. They have nothing to do with IQ. They're more about perspective taking and balance and fairness rather than cognitive complexity as it's usually understood. And this same phenomenon shows up, not just in looking at the other side of the case, but in creativity. Some people are more willing to think more broadly. Some tend to hang back and not think as broadly. Again, it doesn't seem to have that much to do with IQ. So there are these dimensions of thinking that are not so much a matter of cognitive complexity. One way to put it is that they're matters of disposition. Disposition is a word that psychologists and educators use to describe how a thinker tends or how a thinker invests his or her effort. Not what their ability is, but how they invest it, in what directions they lean. It turns out that a lot of good thinking has at least as much to do with dispositions as it does with abilities. And if we want to help people to think better, we need to work on those dispositions. So what does this have to do with hacking the mind? Back to hacking the mind. Here's the definition again: getting something to work outside its normal range in a relatively simple way, leveraging existing capacities rather than developing complex new capacities. If a lot of the problems of everyday thinking are dispositional, if they're a matter of how we invest our mental capabilities, then hacking is a good idea. Hacking gives us tricks and tools and strategies for a different pattern of investment. It cues us to redirect abilities we already have in more powerful directions. And back to our little person here, this is exactly what a strategy like listing pros and cons does. It's a request to be more careful and pay more attention to both the pros and the cons. Or strategies from Edward de Bono, who will be here later in the conference, like OPV, standing for other point of view, or PMI, plus, minus, and interesting points about an issue. Those also are cues to broaden your thinking. Or various strategies for perspective taking that invite you to view a situation from multiple perspectives. Colleagues and I who work a lot on a program called Visible Thinking, for instance, one of our perspective-taking strategies is called Circle of Viewpoints. And it's a deliberate request for a small group to identify 4 or 5 different viewpoints about an issue and act them out, dramatize them, so to speak. Or step inside, another visible thinking strategy that asks you, the learner, to try to step inside a situation, to pretend you are a such and such, to pretend you are a president, or pretend you are a revolutionary. And not just people either, but for instance, to pretend you're a river, or an ocean, or an atom. And this leverages the already present human capacity for empathy, perspective taking, and that mental simulation space that we have available to us. Very exciting. All of these are hacks. They're easy. They're easy, but we often just don't do that kind of thing as a matter of course. But all it takes is a little prompt, a little nudge, a little structure, a little organization, and all of a sudden our minds are going down a new path. Very exciting. So, this might lead to a real puzzle. And the puzzle is, why do we even need these reminders? Why do I ever have to remind myself, David, use a pro-con list? Or let's say there's a tricky social situation. Why do I have to remind myself, David, step inside, see what that other viewpoint might be like? Try to take another person's perspective. Why do I ever have to remind myself of those things? Why don't I just do them automatically, since they're good things to do? Well, some cognitive scientists have thought a lot about this, and here is one way of explaining what they've concluded. This is a brain-shaped piggy bank, by the way. If you want to invest in your thinking, that's the trick. Use a brain-shaped piggy bank. Well, what cognitive scientists have suggested is that basically we have a cognitive budget, and it's not a very big cognitive budget. We have only so much capacity to think about complicated things, and we spend that capacity in a lean, conservative way. Now you might ask yourself, why should we be so reserved? Why don't we do a lot more complex, two-sided, out-of-the-box thinking? Very good question. And for one reason, look at this slide. This is what life is like. There's all sorts of choices, all sorts of roads, all sorts of loops, all sorts of branches. Imagine you went through the day thinking carefully about every step you took, every choice you made, every issue that came up, every puzzle that presented itself, every politician who has had something to say on TV, every advertisement you encountered. Good God, that's what life is like. All those complicated roads and branches. Who has the time? The reality is that there's no place near the time in the world, no matter how smart any of us are, to engage in complicated thinking about everything that comes up. We need to do cognitive budgeting. We need to be quite conservative about where we spend our complex mental effort. So, we have a cognitive budget, and, like any budget, it isn't quite right. There are little mistakes built in here and there. Let's go back to our brain bank and imagine our little person here putting money into his brain bank, and he's doing it to save mental resources. But it's not just the fact that the world is so complicated. The other point that cognitive scientists have emphasized is that capacity to think about complex things is distinctly limited. A key figure here is a scientist named Simon, winner of the Nobel Prize, who talked about bounded rationality. He basically said, look, if you stand back and look carefully at the way people think, we have a limited working memory, that simulation space. There's limited time. There's all sorts of difficulties with holding complexity in mind. Even if you write it down, that can quickly get out of hand. So we have bounded rationality. We can't get as complicated as we might like to. Even when we have strong motivation, we can't get as complicated as we might like to. So we think with a process that Simon calls satisficing. S-A-T-I-S-F-I-C-I-N-G. Satisficing. It's a made-up word, a word he coined, and it means good enough. We think about something until it seems good enough. I'm clear enough about that. I'm confident enough about that. And I stop. In contrast with optimizing, in contrast with thinking as elaborately as we can until we're pretty sure that we've covered every possible angle. Satisficing, in contrast with optimizing, Simon emphasizes that of necessity, as organisms of bounded rationality, we are satisficers. That's what we do most of the time. It simply takes too much time to optimize, and we don't have the mental machinery for it. Satisficing. Not only that, but to do this good enough kind of thinking, we as human beings use a lot of what are usually called heuristics. They're mental shortcuts of various kinds. Mental shortcuts that are good bets. 90% of the time, that's a good bet, so I'll do that. 90% of the time, I don't really have to look carefully at the other side of the case. So on the whole, I don't. That kind of thing. And in fact, there's practically an industry out there in the world of psychology of researching various of these shortcut heuristics that 90% of the time give pretty good results. But then there's the other 10% of the time when they don't. Well, that's where hacking the mind comes in. Put it this way. We can't get rid of satisficing. We have to have a tight cognitive budget. There's not enough time and there's not enough mental capacity. But what we can do is smarter satisficing. We can be a little more selective, a little more careful about just where we look carefully at the other side of the case, or just where we do perspective taking, or just where we think outside of the box. We can just be a little smarter about that investment and get big gains. That's why it's interesting to talk about hacking the mind, because that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying on the whole to develop whole new, completely unheard of mental capacities. We're trying to edit our budget. We're trying to edit our budget so the patterns of investment are just a little smarter. So, 10 ways of hacking the mind. Most of these will be familiar. They're supposed to be familiar. A couple may not. But I just want to put these forward to illustrate how all of this has to do with little tricks and moves and strategies for investing one's mental budget differently with significant gains in performance. Okay, let's just remind ourselves of a familiar pro-con list. That's a perfectly good example. Let's go back to this crazy world that I showed you before. This is a good reminder of all the decision-making we have to do, and there are a number of thinking strategies that basically have to do with sharpening up a bit that decision-making process when it's important, when it's worth the bother. For instance, yes, thinking about the pros and the cons, thinking about the long-term, not just the short-term consequences, thinking about hidden options, one of the big problems with everyday decision making is that often people just take the given options as what to choose between, rather than being more imaginative and looking for hidden options. One of my favorite folk sayings is, between two options, pick the third. It's good advice. Between two options, pick the third. Reach for the hidden possibilities before you just decide between the two. Or, a lot of what we hear in the world from friends or books or advertisement, well, there are serious questions of truth. So we need to be asking ourselves, and our children need to be asking, about the reliability of sources. What reason do I have to trust this politician, or this advertisement, or this supposedly scientific report? What kinds of bias might lie behind it? Who has a particular gain they might achieve by misrepresenting things, sometimes even by misrepresenting things not intentionally? So many people, including my colleague Bob Swartz, emphasize, let's cultivate our alertness to the reliability of sources. Whoops, I missed one. Okay, this is about thinking outside the box, creativity. It's kind of a cliche. Everybody talks about thinking about outside the box, but you know, it's a good thing to do. And there are a lot of tricks for thinking outside the box, including brainstorming. We tend not to think about outside the box. We tend to just go with the flow. But one can learn to prompt oneself to think outside the box, and it's not that hard. It's a hack. It exercises capabilities we already have. We just have to stir them up and put them to work. Thinking outside the box. Or, this is an interesting one, research shows that a lot of human problem solving is solution-minded. That means when you face a problem, it could be a textbook problem, or it could be an everyday problem. When you face a problem, you tend very quickly to reach for solutions. And maybe you come up with something good, or not. But the thing is, not infrequently you've solved the wrong problem. Not infrequently you have assumed that the problem is X, but actually you could say the problem was Y instead. So, one important thinking move is to ask yourself, well, what's the problem really? Or what else might it be? How else could we look at the problem? How else could we frame the problem? So that's another simple thinking hack. Once you ask people to think about what the problem really is, they can easily do so. It's a hack. It doesn't require some new ability. The thing is, we don't prompt ourselves to do that. So we want to reinvest that mental budget a little bit. Okay, let me turn to some other, perhaps somewhat less familiar examples that are kind of provocative. Many people here will have heard of the work on mindsets by Carol Dweck and her colleagues. How many people have heard about mindsets? I do see a few hands. That's great. Carol Dweck and colleagues have discovered that people have mental models of their own intelligence. This goes back to the recursion business. You have a model of yourself as a thinker. And some people's mental models of their own intelligence say, my intelligence is fixed. It can't be improved. I do the best I can with what I have. Other people's models of their intelligence say, my intelligence can be improved if I invest effort, if I be systematic, and so forth. This is a very serious issue. It's been shown that a lot of school children have fixed mindsets rather than growth mindsets. They believe their capacities are fixed rather than that their capacities are subject to growth. But it turns out that you can change their underlying mental model. You can promote a growth mindset by talking about it, by sharing research findings, and in other ways. It doesn't even take very long. It's a hack. It's a manipulation that can be done a few times in a relatively quick way and has been known to shift children's attitudes toward the improvability of their intelligence. And when you do this, they learn better. They manage themselves better. Very interesting. Here's another example. One problem with learning, and particularly learning in schools, learning typical topics, is that students do not see those topics as very significant. They see them as for the test. They see them for writing an essay at the end of the unit, and then it's over. There's a hack for that. There's a researcher by the name of Engel who has developed a notion called expansive framing. This contrasts with bounded framing. So if I'm a teacher and I say, hey, we're going to spend a while on the French Revolution, if I want to frame that in an expansive, broad way to create your commitment and interest, I say, and the French Revolution connects to all sorts of things. It connects to other revolutions, like the Russian Revolution. It connects to ways we might change our own lives. It connects with what's happening right now in small ways in our country. Connects with what was happening in Russia. Connects with the Arab Spring. The teacher emphasizes the possible connections. Oh, and here's something else the teacher does for expansive framing. The teacher says, and by the way, we're going to spend 2 weeks now on this, but that's not the end of it. We won't be done at the end of 2 weeks. In a way, we'll just be started. And in the future, other things we explore will tie back to this. And perhaps in other courses and in later years, you will find things tying back to this. That's expansive framing. Now, if I as a teacher want to do bounded framing, I don't know why I would, but it's what happens a lot. I would say, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to study the French Revolution. We want you to learn a lot about the French Revolution. At the end of the 2 weeks, there'll be a test on the French Revolution. And then we'll move on to the Industrial Revolution, or something like that. Well, it turns out that expansive framing has an impact on how much learners want to learn. Now, imagine we could also teach learners to do their own expansive framing. Wouldn't that be something? What about mood? You know, sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm sad, sometimes I'm angry. Here's a very different kind of hack. Body posture. Did you know that you can change your mood simply by changing your posture? Bear that in mind. How many people have noticed that you can change your mood by changing your posture? Yeah, that's a hack. All you have to do is know about it, and you can put it to work. And it's very easy. This is one of many things that Guy Claxton writes about in a book soon to come out that talks about the relationship between mind and body. Body posture. What about prejudice? Prejudice against immigrants, prejudice against people from other races, prejudice against people of different colors or different social levels. Well, there are some hacks for this. This is one of the toughest, actually. This is really difficult, but there are some manipulations that have been shown to reduce prejudice a little bit, at least in the short term, and they tend to use what cognitive scientists call cognitive dissonance. They tend to set up situations where I, the learner, have a certain kind of experience that relates positively to the group discriminated against. And oddly enough, the experience is supposed to be relatively mild, not too extreme, just kind of encouraging and so forth and so on. And I, as the learner, ask myself, why am I responding positively? I must like those people after all. I must feel not as negative as I thought I did. Otherwise, why I'm behaving this way? Well, there's a long, complicated story behind cognitive dissonance, but there are some manipulations that help reduce prejudice a little bit, at least in the short term. And if they're continued, which is the tricky part, presumably in the long term. Now let me turn to my favorite example here. This, of course, is the iceberg that's 90% underwater and 10% above water. This is a reminder of the intuitive mind, which is largely underwater. We don't know that clearly what's going on in our intuitive mind, but it gives us some interesting insights. One of the most interesting kinds of hack is to turn back to the intuitive mind. A lot of thinking strategies make things more elaborate. Write it all down. Analyze those pros and cons. Give them weights, and so forth and so on. But there's another kind of turn, another pattern of investment that says, look, go back and listen to your intuitions a little more. You might ask, why should that be necessary? Wouldn't our intuitions always speak for themselves? The answer is no. Our intuitions don't always speak to themselves. For one thing, we can sometimes get too elaborate and forget to look at our intuitions. For another thing, sometimes our intuitions speak with a soft voice, and we don't hear our intuitions speaking to us. So there are various tricks for probing one's intuitions. One that almost everybody says is, I'm going to sleep on it. How many people have said to themselves, I'm going to sleep on it, or I'm going to let that sit for a day and see how I feel about it? How many people have done things like that? I certainly do. And you know, it often yields some insight, right? It often is clearer the next day or the day after that. That's one simple hack. Here's another one. Sometimes if you don't know how you feel about something, it helps to give it a letter grade. I'm not really sure about that. Okay, how would I rate it? A, B, or C? Or how would I rate it on a 10-point scale? I'm still not doing an elaborate analysis, but I'm just asking my mind to give it a grade. And often if I just ask my mind to give it a grade, my mind intuitively will give it a grade. And that helps me know how I really feel about something. So, the turn back to intuition, which sometimes we neglect. Now, this does not mean that your intuition is always right. It absolutely is not always right, but it's another important source of information. So, it's a mistake to neglect its voice. We want to hear what it has to say, and then we want to be sure we're confident of what it has to say. So ask your intuition. Don't just assume that your intuition is speaking for itself. Ask it in some way. Prompt it in some way. Another hack. Okay, let me say a word about hacking as empowerment versus entrapment. Some of you are probably thinking this word hacking is kind of scary. It sounds like evil hackers. Well, there's a reason to worry about that. There's a reason for those worried eyes. In fact, there are evil hacks. Here are some of them. A lot of advertisements, temptations like payday loans, pretty pictures of food, and so forth and so on. These are hacks too. They are very simple interventions that tend to tap into automatic responses of our mind. And those are the tempting ones, the attractive ones. There are also scary hacks, like the evil robots or aliens, or fear of nuclear disaster, or disease. And don't forget how often these get used in the public arena by politicians or leaders that have one or another angle they want to promote by using these fears and using these temptations. So there is such a thing, absolutely, as evil hacking the mind. These fit the definition of hacking just as well as the positive examples I gave of thinking skills. But what's the difference? Well, here's the difference. It's the difference between empowerment and entrapment. The thinking skills we've been talking about, the thinking hacks, basically empower the learner. They put the learner in a position to invest the cognitive budget in a smarter way. On the other hand, things like sneaky advertisements and playing upon people's fears are entrapping. They narrow the cognitive horizon rather than broadening the cognitive horizon. This is just a point we need to acknowledge. The spirit of hacking can be used for good or evil. We're interested in the good stuff. In saying this, I also want to think back to a friend, and I could be thinking back of many other people too, but this is a philosopher by the name of Israel Scheffler. He passed away a little more than a year ago, and he wrote a wonderful series of essays called In Praise of the Cognitive Emotions. One thing you might think when I gave those examples of the evil hacks, the fears, the temptation, oh, it's all about the emotions. Emotions are bad. You know, they're where fuzzy thinking comes from. What we want to do is stay away from those messy emotions. Absolutely not true. It depends on what emotion you're talking about and what its magnitude is. Scheffler celebrated what he called the power of the cognitive emotions, the emotions that give us insight into what's new, like surprise. Surprise is a feeling that tells us what's new. Sometimes the new is good, sometimes it's bad, but it's a signal to us. Like curiosity, a very powerful emotion. There are lots of powerful positive emotions. So, in worrying about evil hacks, we don't mean to be worried about emotions in a sweeping way. In fact, emotions are one of several ways in which our intuitive voices talk to us. Okay. Let me try and wind up. How to make hacking the mind last. This is the tricky part. What's the real problem? I encourage that we ask ourselves what the real problem is. Here's a way to put it. Suppose you put Post-its on a brick wall. What usually happens when you put Post-its on a brick wall? They fall off. They don't stick very well. Well, a lot of times our minds are kind of like brick walls. When you try to put those hacks, well, they last for a day or so, but they fall off. A lot of these hacks don't stick very well. So the real big challenge for us in cultivating a smarter world, in making the most of the mind, is to help people learn in a way that touches what happens in schools, young children, in the political arena, in the business world, in community matters, in shopping, in community service, in the medical world, in sports, in teaching, to cultivate hacks in a way so that they spread through people's lives, don't just stay stuck in what we do Friday morning. And there are many ways we know to do that. This is the good news. Simply revisit things. Look for applications beyond school. If you're teaching in school, prompt students to take the ideas beyond school. Have students keep thinking logbooks. Infusion into diverse content, so it's not just about today's topic, but about tomorrow's and about that other class. Addressing mindsets, just like we talked about before, Carol Dweck's work. Cultivating people's identity as a thinker, encouraging them to reflect on what kind of a thinker am I? fostering habits of mind, a concept that Art Costa and Ben Akalik and others have worked with extensively, cultivate those habits of mind. Expansive framing that we talked about before, so that learners see the broadness of the enterprise. And just plain persistence all over the place over time. There's a lot we can do to make hacking stick. But we shouldn't deceive ourselves to think that it sticks automatically. It's something we need to work on as educators. And one way to do that is to encourage the hacker spirit, to encourage students to think of themselves as messing around in productive ways with their own mind. Messing around in productive, proactive, parsimonious, and playful ways to make the most of the mind. There's a spirit to this, not just a set of technical skills. It's very much a passionate, emotional, attitudinal enterprise. Okay, enough of that. Here's my quick summary. First, key qualities of the mind are immediate intuition, the power of representation to dramatically expand it, and what emerges from that, our recursive power to edit how we think. And here it is, some of the ways we can edit how we think. Pros and cons, Venn diagrams, what's the real problem, and so on, very much in the tradition of the teaching of thinking, and they're all really thinking hacks. Hacking the mind, a proactive, parsimonious, playful enterprise. Why does the mind need hacking? Because of the cognitive budget. Because we really can't think elaborately about anything. It's beyond our capacity, and it's not smart to try to think elaborately about everything. And as we keep a careful cognitive budget, don't forget it's not about getting more elaborate all the time. Sometimes it's turning back to listen to what our intuition has to say. Yes, hacking can be for evil, but we're talking about good hacking. We're talking about hacking the mind in ways that are empowering to learners rather than entrapping for learners. And to make the most of the mind, we need to make that hacking stick. We need to get those post-its up in ways so that they don't fall off and spread far and wide through learners' lives. And that, among other things, is very much the spirit of the international conferences on thinking. I'm so glad you're here today. Thank you for participating.